All right. So classes are this whole other thing that we've had experience with, but we didn't really talk about them in that way. Classes are different kinds of objects in Python, and there's a number of like predefined ones, like a list or a dictionary is kind of like a class, a very like fundamental one. The ones that we've been using a lot recently are pandas data frames or series, but we can also make our own classes, which we'll do today. So this provides a means of bundling data and functionality together. And so when we create a class, it creates a new type of object, and then that allows new instances or tokens of that type to be made. So each class instance can have attributes that are attached to it. For example, an attribute could just be a string that you can attach to something that every new instance of that class has a string associated with it. And classes can also have methods, which are like functions that can be used to modify it or to output something. So I like philosophy, so I'm going to use a philosophical reference here. In philosophy and logic, there's this distinction between types and tokens. A type is the sort of the general idea of a thing, and the token is the actual physical version of that thing, and there can be many of them, right? So, for example, many of you have a MacBook computer. That's a type of computer, but the physical object you possess. So Lisa's MacBook has, colorful things on the cover, and Grant's MacBook is dark, and you all have different tokens of a MacBook, but you know what this thing is. So it's not the same thing, right? So this is like a class. So a class is a type of object. You create a class, you create a new class, which is a new type of object. But when you actually use it, you're instantiating, or you are creating tokens. You're creating like individual variables that have all the properties of the class. They inherit all the properties of the class. So just like when you create a data frame in pandas, right? That has all the properties of a data frame, but it's not like it has distinctness from other data frames because it has certain values that are distinct to it. So if you want to create many objects that all have the same properties and that they won't interfere with each other, you can use classes. So this is opposed to, say, other kind of data that you would put into a module that you only import once, and that you only get that information imported once. And so having this class type of structure allows you to create many copies of the same thing and use them in different ways. So we're going to use this example from Learn Python the Hard Way. I've changed it a little bit. So we're going to copy this text and save it as a .py file. So copy that. And this time I'm just going to use good old cat to create that. So I'm going to cat to my class.py, hit enter. I'm going to paste that text. And I always like to add a new line at the end, make sure that kind of cleaner style. And then you can hit Control C. So we've now created this module, myclass.py, that we can import and have access to. So again, we're going to open up IPython, and we can type import myclass. So we now have, if we just type myclass, there's only one thing in that Again, we're not worried about this file name. What we're interested in is what's inside that module. So my class is a class that we created that's in this file here. And so what we want to do is we want to create an instance of that class. We're going to call it Paul. And we're going to, by adding these parentheses, we're saying we're not going to copy the class to a variable. We're going to instantiate it. We're going to run that class, and it's going to create a new thing, and we can look at Paul, and it tells us it belongs to this module, my class, and within that it's this class called my class. And so Paul now has these attributes that we assign to it. So we can type Paul.walrus, which is an attribute, or we can type Paul.chew, and it prints goo goo gajube. Because when we created the class, we defined those things. So here's the basic structure of the class. So the first thing we type is class. So this says, hey, I'm going to make a new class. We then type the name of the class. This time it's going to be called my class. And then we always put this word object in there. What that means is that this class is going to inherit, it's going to inherit the properties of classes. So this is sort of like inheritance kind of thing where object says, okay, this is a class object. We're going to create a new class, and that's going to inherit all the features of a class. Gets kind of confusing, but that's what's happening here. So we always, anytime we make a class, we do it that way. And we have, optionally, we can define this init function. So again, we're seeing this double underscore type of variable, and then the word init, and then another double underscore, and then self. So these two things have special meaning. Init says this is a function that's going to be run every time we make a class. We're going to run this function, and it's going to be run on the object itself. So this self is a special variable that refers to the instance that we're creating. So that new instance will have an attribute called walrus, and every time we make a new instance, it will have that attribute, and that attribute is just this string. We can also, here we're defining a function, and that function doesn't take any arguments except for the object itself. So the first argument is self. If we wanted to have a function that took additional arguments, we could add them, we could put a comma and add those other arguments just like we would with any other function. But this is just a regular function that doesn't take any arguments, but it just prints out this string. So then what we did was we imported that module, we instantiated that class and called it Paul. So Paul.walrus gives us this attribute walrus, which is I am the walrus string, and Paul.chew gives us printing this string goo goo gajube down here. This is probably the most confusing thing we'll talk about in this class. So if this is not natural to you, that's normal. But we'll see a few more examples of this, and I think it'll make more sense. So again, you instantiate, which is just a fancy word for create, a class by calling the class like it's a function. So we saw that here. We're calling that class like it's a function, and that makes an instance. When you do instantiate an object from a class, Python does these following things. So this is a handy little sort of step-by-step thing from Shaw. So Python looks for my class and sees that it's a class that you've defined. So we defined it up here. So it's going to go and say, okay, I saw that you just defined that class in your module. So I'm going to go and look at that class. It creates an empty object with all the functions that you specified using def. So it's going to just add those functions in. It's then going to see if you made one of these magic init functions, and we did. And if you have, it will call that function to initialize your newly created empty object. So this happens first, and it's going to add that attribute walrus to your object. And we also get this extra variable self, which is that empty object that Python made, and you can set variables on it like you would with a module dictionary or other objects. So that's what we're doing here. We're using this, creating this variable self, which is referring to the object itself, and that object will have this attribute. And when we made this other definition isn't run yet, but it's just stored. And so when we do run that function, it knows that, okay, I'm going to run this function on just the object itself, which means it doesn't take any other arguments, except it's just referring to the object itself, and it will print this string. Okay, so here is another example. It's a very similar example. So we can copy this song.py. So we're going to exit out of here. And just be mindful of lowercase, uppercase, underscores, all those things. There's reasons we're using these conventions, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we're creating a new class called song. Again, it takes object as its inherited class properties. We're going to have this init function, and this time the init will take an argument. So this is useful. This means that when we instantiate that object, or when we create that object, we have to give some value to it. We can't just create it out of itself. And then it's going to have this function that will print itself. And we hit Control C. All right. And so we're going to again load up IPython. And we can type from song import star. So we're going to do it a little differently this time. We're going to import everything into the current namespace. So we don't have to type lowercase song dot uppercase song. We can just type uppercase song. So we can now copy these lyrics. Let's make sure that, yep, it worked. Copy this second lyrics. And if you get that thing where IPython has generated a new line, you can just hit enter, and it will it'll realize that you're done executing that content, and it will execute the line. All right, so we're going to now create a song instance using this song, this song class that we created. So we can say song 1 is going to be a song having lyrics 1. And so when we create that song object, it will be initialized. So those lyrics that we pass to it will be stored as this attribute self.lyrics. And then we're also going to define this function that will just print the lyrics. Okay, and we can do the same thing for lyrics 2. Create song 2. So now we have this class, this instance of this class, song 1, and if we just print it by itself, it just tells us it's a song. It doesn't actually do anything. So but we have this function that we created called printIt, which will grab those lyrics that we stored in the init function and then print them. So it'll print song 1, which is a Beatles song, and we can print song 2, which is not a Beatles song. So this is a similar example to what we just saw, but there's a few minor differences. Any questions on that?
So in order to use self, I have to use the double dash init double dash.
That's a good question. Do we need to have the? Let's try something. Let me see if this works. Yeah. Okay. So, do we need to have the init function to use self? I'm not sure, so let's find out. I'm going to delete that from this previous module, my class. We'll see if it works. So we can import. Let's do, we call that Paul. Let's call him George. Okay. No. So yeah. So yeah, I used some of this language from Zed Shaw, so it might be a little misleading. I think what we're saying here. Sorry. What we're saying here is that within the init function, you have self that you can do things with. I think the idea is that self has a special meaning, and that with init, or actually with any of these, you can use. You're passing self to the. So it knows that self is a special variable, but it's then passing it to the function. So within the function, you can use that and assign things to it. But I'm pretty sure that assigning attributes has to be done in the init function and not in like other functions. I need to play around with that a little bit to see how far you can push it. But that would be a good exercise to do, is to just to play with that. More questions? Okay.